Americans are casting their ballots in the lead-up to Election Day on Tuesday, November 3rd, as the country sees a resurgence of COVID-19 cases. To elect or re-elect a president, that's the question.
But I'll tell you, Joe, you could never have done the job that we did. You don't have it in your blood.
You're the worst president America has ever had.
Hey, Joe,
on.
A choice between COVID survivor President Donald Trump
I feel so powerful. I'll walk into that audience.
and a senator and former vice president under the Obama administration.
America deserves a president who understands what people are going through.
The pandemic is only one of the many issues on the minds of the American people. It's a divided America on race, healthcare, and immigration. Trump or Biden, who will be America's choice? This is a CNN Philippines special presentation, Politics as Usual in America. It's the final stretch of the race to the White House. Welcome to the program. I'm Pio Ontiveros. Donald Trump and Joe Biden shared the same stage for the last time. It was a much more coherent debate compared to the first one. Topics included the most obvious issues on the minds of Americans, from COVID-19 to the economy, healthcare, as well as race and immigration. The first question, as expected, focused on what many in the world are worrying about, COVID-19. Mr. Trump again blamed China for the problem, but assured Americans he has it under control.
It will go away, and as I say, we're rounding the turn, we're rounding the corner. It's going away.
For his part, Biden criticized the president for not doing enough. He says it's time for Mr. Trump to go.
220,000 Americans dead. If you hear nothing else I say tonight, hear this. Anyone who's responsible for not taking control, in fact, not saying I take no responsibility initially, anyone who's responsible for that many deaths should not remain as President of the United States of America.
So who won this rematch, this final round? We spoke to CNN's Karen Kafer from Nashville, Tennessee, who covered the debate.
Well, according to a CNN poll of voters after the debate, that win would go to Joe Biden. But by a slimmer margin than voters agreed upon in the first debate in Cleveland, where the margin was much wider in favor of Joe Biden. We saw President Trump come out a little bit more restrained than he was in the first debate. That was at the recommendation of advisors who said he needed to cut back on the interruptions of Joe Biden, perhaps let Joe Biden talk on his own a little bit more and maybe talk himself into a corner or talk himself into a gaffe. It was also helped along by new guardrails put in place against that chaos by the Commission on Presidential Debates, which oversees all of these proceedings. They made a decision to put a mute button in effect for at least the first answer that each of these candidates gave to each of the 6 segments. So each candidate got 2 minutes of interrupted time with the mute button for their opponents to address the topic at hand. So it looks as though this was not the game changer that President Trump was seeking as he tries to revive in some way his struggling re-election bid.
But the next question, of course, Karen, is that is this debate and the results going to change the minds of voters?
That's always an interesting question, especially in the current cycle that we are in right now. Americans have never voted in the midst of a global pandemic, and so that makes things a lot different, not only from the way they approach their decision, but also from the way they actually physically vote. More than 47 million Americans have already voted, so last night's debate wasn't going to make much of a difference to them. And here in the U.S., if you look at the polls, you found that there was a very small sliver of undecided voters to begin with. The two parties seem to be very polarized. The two camps of voters seem to be very polarized. So the idea that someone is still waffling and struggling over this decision, those are few and far between right now. So just because of the way Americans have been voting, and again, trying to do it early, standing in line early on to avoid doing it on Election Day when there could be more crowds that could potentially expose them to more coronavirus. Just the way that this election has kind of proceeded makes it a little less likely than perhaps in other cycles that this final debate of the election cycle would have a big impact.
So they're voting in the middle of this pandemic at the same time, in the middle of this well, very bad economy. I mean, well, not just in the U.S., of course, but all over the world. So these are the issues that matter to Americans. What else are top of mind when Americans go to the polls or when they send in their votes?
Well, COVID-19 is certainly top of mind for many Americans, not only the public health crisis aspect of it, but also the economic consequences. Millions of Americans are currently unemployed. This was an economy here in the U.S. that was kind of going along with some historically low unemployment before the coronavirus pandemic hit. And so you have these two candidates really drawing some sharp contrasts in terms of where they would go next. President Trump likes to lay the blame at China, that the coronavirus originated there, that he had been kind of carrying along a really good-looking economy, and then the coronavirus came from China and wrecked it. That is how he frames it, and that is how he kind of frames his economic message going forward to Americans. If we can just get rid of this virus, which he says, you know, contrary to what public health experts say, he says that we are turning a corner. If you just put the re-election in his hands, give him another 4 years, he'll be able to restore the American economy. Joe Biden sees it very differently. He sees it that you cannot really fully restore the U.S. economy until the virus is eradicated. And his closing argument to Americans has been that President Trump has mishandled severely the coronavirus pandemic here in the United States. So that was really front and center for these candidates as they made their closing arguments. Obviously, there are great distinctions on issues like immigration, like the racial tensions that we have seen here in the United States in recent months, that they were able to really communicate those distinctions a little bit better than when we had all of the crosstalk on that debate stage in Cleveland a few weeks ago.
And Karen, my last question: what do the poll numbers look like 2 weeks before Election Day, and what needs to happen, you know, so that one candidate will have the upper hand here? And yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, with all of the craziness and the tumult that has happened here in the United States regarding the pandemic and other stories over the last few months, this presidential race has remained relatively steady, with Joe Biden enjoying a comfortable lead in the national polls. Of course, there's still 11 days to go here, and here in the U.S., these elections are made and they are broken by the important battleground states. And so you're going to see these candidates visiting those states a lot in the upcoming days, trying to influence the polls. Biden trying to pad his lead and Trump trying to make a comeback.
That was CNN's Karen Kafer reporting from Nashville, Tennessee. We want to make sense of it all, from the issues, the polls, to the heated barbs that's been going on the past year. Decision day is right around the corner. Joining us today are Dindo Manhid, our resident analyst. Also with us, former presidential spokesperson Edwin Lacerda. Well, the United States has the most number of COVID-19 cases and casualties, over 8 million cases, and more than 200,000 deaths have been recorded in America. Just this month, Mr. Trump himself caught the coronavirus, as well as the First Lady. But the 74-year-old commander-in-chief continues to downplay health protocols and the science backing them. The pandemic has not spared Filipino health frontliners. 4% of registered nurses in the U.S. are Filipinos, and more than a third of nurses who died in the line of COVID-19 duty in America are Filipinos. What are the stakes for us in the November polls happening in the middle of a global pandemic? Dindo Manhid and Edwin Lacerda are joining us. Dindo, Edwin, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Well, let's begin with this. Of course, Mr. Trump blaming China, as he always does. And everybody remembers how he used to not want to wear a mask. At the same time, Joe Biden saying, I'm going to take care of things. I'll make sure we have a plan. I will make sure that we get rid of this COVID-19. How is this going to factor in for voters in the U.S.? Dindo, you first.
Yeah, I think President Trump focused on his base. When you listen to his debate arguments and even the past few days, he's basically rallying his base of supporters. I think he knows that he's not doing well in terms of majority votes, but really targeting the base of support in key states, given their electoral college system. On the part of former Vice President Biden, he really projects a character that is the opposite of President Trump, which is really more of the mature leadership that the world needs today. He always argues from a point of view that the U.S. is a global leader, maybe in a more multipolar world, more internationalist posturing on his part, but he's ready to lead and projecting more maturity than the bombastic President Trump.
All right, Edwin?
Well, in a normal election, the economy would have been the fundamental primordial issue. And in that respect, President Trump would have had the advantage. So the economy was doing well prior to the pandemic, but these are abnormal times. And so because of the pandemic, and which was handled poorly by President Trump, it has become the focal issue. And as we all know, over 200,000 dead Americans who have passed away because of COVID. That has become the fundamental issue, and economy has been relegated to the back. In addition, there were a number of issues confronting race, which apparently did not sit well also with President Trump's handling. And in those two respects, former Vice President Biden have handled the corona pandemic well. He's given his formula to handle the pandemic. He's given the statistics, given the fact that President Trump is in denial in handling the pandemic. And also with respect to the issues, Vice President Biden has made an issue of the race and how he made it appear that the President Trump is a racist, which sat well with most of the Americans. Also, because of the pandemic, the base of President Trump, the senior citizens, which usually is his base, fell out of favor with President Trump because of the appearance that he was neglecting the senior citizens. So with the shift of demographics towards former Vice President Biden, it appears that former Vice President Biden is headed towards a victory. Given also that unlike 2016, the favorability rating of former Vice President Biden is vastly much improved over Hillary Clinton.
All right, we're gonna talk more, Edwin and Dindo, about those issues, the economy, race, immigration, in just a bit in the latter half of the show. We will come back to both of you. In the meantime, we know the world is closely watching America. How can you not? For more on how the rest of the world views the U.S. elections, we're joined live from London by CNN's international diplomatic editor, Nick Robertson. Nick, thank you very much for joining us. Well, let's begin with this. Well, Americans are voting in record numbers. How does the rest of the world perceive the U.S. ahead of November 3rd, Decision Day? And what helps or helped form that perception?
You know, I think the presidential debates and President Trump's actions over the past 4 years form international opinion, if you will. You know, I think to a degree, Vice President Biden's 8 years as vice president will have formed an opinion in capitals. And certainly, you know, if you just look at the debate this evening, you have the contrasting ways of dealing with the international community, and it was Vice President Biden who said, "Look, President Trump sticks his fingers in the eyes of his allies while cozying up to people like President Vladimir Putin of Russia." Biden's narrative, and I think this is one that's broadly perceived in capitals, particularly in Europe, particularly among allies around the world, is that he would reset and go back to some of the foreign policy instincts that he had during President Obama's era. He would rejoin the Paris Climate Change Accord. He would perhaps take a different tack than President Trump, and we heard President Trump again saying how he's managed to get more money out of NATO. But NATO had already agreed to these GDP defense spending increases that they are beginning to follow through on. There's another 4 years for them to complete. So Biden's narrative, I think, is one, and his narrative is that he will work with allies to keep people like, as he sees, China and others in line, whether it's over climate or whether it's over interfering in elections, which he said there would be a price for, that these countries would have to pay Russia, China and Iran accused of meddling in these US elections. So Biden clearly tries to establish a better rapport with allies. And I think that is something that's understood to be probably what would happen. whereas Trump, I think the reality is that that his influence has been very disturbing. People might agree with him on some of the trade issues to do with China, etc., and their trade policies, but it's been destabilizing. So, I think they're understood in this context. Reality is, for the international community, they can only really watch what happens and wait and see. They don't get a voice in this.
Right, they don't vote. It's the Americans who vote. But how would you define Donald Trump's global image then?
As a disruptor, I think it depends, whether you're talking about, which group of people you're talking about. His partners in the Gulf, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, like President Trump, has been very tough on Iran, and they see Iran and Iran's style of politics in the Middle East as negative. So there's been strong support from President Trump there. Here in Europe, it's less of a rosy picture. Instinctively, Europe looks to the United States to lead the way on international foreign policy issues that the world can get behind, whether it's climate change, whether it's dealing with Russia over Russia's involvement in Libya or Syria, or its invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea. European governments look for a joined-up approach, and they haven't had that. They've had somebody who comes across as a disruptor. I think for President Xi in China, it's posed clear challenges that have been very difficult, but it's put him on a path that perhaps a different president, Hillary Clinton, it would have been if it wasn't President Trump 4 years ago, would have not brought about such a pressure on China and such a change in China's action. But this is something President Biden in the future, if he does become president, of course, Vice President Biden, then he would have to deal with it as it stands right now. And he's also saying that he would be tough on China. So, but it does depend, I think, where you stand in the world on what President Trump has done and how he is. Broadly speaking, the majority of his allies in Europe would be more comfortable with somebody who took a more inclusive and less America First policy. Broadly speaking, his allies and partners in the Gulf have been, broadly speaking, comfortable with the positions that he's been taking. I think his influence perhaps in Asia has been seen as more disruptive, particularly when it comes to sort of the Trans-Pacific trade partnership that the United States was going to be part of, President Trump pulled out of.
All eyes all over the world focused on the U.S. elections in 2 weeks' time. Nick Robertson, CNN's international diplomatic editor, thank you very much for joining us this evening. When we return, a closer look at our long-standing relations with the United States. We'll speak with Philippine Ambassador to Washington, Babe Romualdez. Also, when it comes to the race for the White House, why is 270 the magic number? We'll break down the complex voting system in America later on in the show. This is a CNN Philippines special presentation, Politics as Usual in America. Americans are casting their ballots in record numbers ahead of Election Day on Tuesday, November 3rd. You're watching a CNN Philippines special presentation, Politics as Usual in America. I'm Pia Ontiveros. The U.S. electoral process is quite complex. While the popular vote elects members of Congress, mayors, governors, and other state officials, it doesn't determine the winner of the presidency. When Americans cast their ballots for the U.S. president, they're actually voting for a representative of that candidate's party. That representative is known as an elector. An elector pledges to support either Donald Trump or Joe Biden in the Electoral College on behalf of the people in their state. CNN's Brianna Kellar explains.
Americans do not vote directly for their president. I'm not talking about a government conspiracy. I'm talking about the Electoral College, a system that has been around since the birth of our nation. What is the Electoral College? The Electoral College is not a building or institution. It's just the name given to a designated group of people who cast each state's official votes for president. This group is made up of 538 people. Each state has a different number of electors based on their representatives in Congress. So, states like California and Texas have more votes than states like North and South Dakota. The only exception? The District of Columbia, which has 3 electors despite not having any voting members in Congress. How does it work? Each party selects their own group of electors. Each state then empowers the electors who represent the candidate who won the most votes, except Nebraska and Maine, who award electors based on a combination of statewide results and districts won. The candidate who receives at least 270 Electoral College votes becomes the next president. What if there's a tie? If there is a tie, or if somebody doesn't get to 270, the House of Representatives appoints the president, and the Senate chooses the vice president. Why does this system exist? In short, the Electoral College was created as a compromise of several different proposals by the nation's founders. Critics say the system allows candidates to become president without necessarily securing a majority of voters' support, which happened in 2000. Advocates argue it ensures less populated states aren't completely ignored. How are these people selected? The electors are chosen by their political parties in each state. The only rule is that they cannot currently hold office. Can an elector ignore the popular vote? Yes. It's called a faithless elector, but it's rare and it has never affected the outcome of an election. Some states require formal pledges enforced by fines and possible jail time. But historically speaking, members rarely depart from the will of the people.
At this point, let's talk about the U.S. economy. America is seeing its highest unemployment rate since 1948. The country has been on recession since April, and economists say whoever wins next month will have a hard time bringing back those jobs. Still with us, Dino Manhit and Edwin Lasherda. Dino and Edwin, you have these twin problems. Now, still American voters voting in the middle of a pandemic while the economy is doing so badly and so many people out of jobs. How is this going to factor in the voting? Edwin?
Yeah. I think the beauty of the U.S. elections is that they don't vote on the day of elections themselves. A number of states have promulgated rules where you can do voting by mailing your votes and also by in-person voting. In fact, they've started their in-person voting. Several states have different dates, but by and large, if I'm not mistaken, already 48% of the U.S. voters have already cast their votes. So that's the beauty of the U.S. election. So they are able to avoid long lines. They're able to avoid the rush on the day of election by already having the voting spread out over several days, several weeks. No? So that's why 48% of U.S. voters have already cast their votes. It's good for the U.S. And by the way, the demographics is that the early voters tend to be Democrats. The Republicans tend to vote on the last day of the elections.
Mm-hmm. Dino, what's it going to mean that the U.S. has a very bad economy at the moment. So many people are out of jobs. There's a lot of talk and analysis about what president wins a re-election, even if he has this much economic trouble. Now, and then pair that with the pandemic.
I think we all know that the U.S. Suffering from this continuing public health crisis caused by the COVID, and it has really these economic consequences that has affected lives of ordinary Americans, and this will drive the votes of the people in terms of who they think can really uplift them. That's why Trump continues to argue on how he has built a great economy, except for what happened with COVID. But I think we all know also that Biden, on his part, has a track record as former vice president, and the continuing advocacy in the Democratic Party, that they tend to be more concerned with the dispossessed in terms of the U.S., who's really suffering from a lot of unemployment, furloughs, as they call it. So this will really dictate the votes of Americans. And as former Secretary Lacerda mentioned, as they come out voting even ahead of actual election day, you see them really lining up. So it's really very important in this case on their part, I think, that their future is at stake. Where will the country be in the next 4 years? How will the country deal not only with this health crisis, but economic consequences that has really been brought about by this COVID health crisis?
Thank you to both of you, our resident political analyst, Tito Manhit, and former presidential spokesman under the Aquino administration, Edwin Lascerda. It's been very nice speaking with the both of you. Well, to elect or re-elect a president, Biden or Trump, a Democrat or a Republican, what does it mean to us Filipinos? We'll sit down with Philippine Ambassador to the U.S., Babe Romualdez. Stay with us. This is a CNN Philippines special presentation. As we count down to Decision Day in America on Tuesday, November 3rd, CNN Philippines brings you this special presentation, Politics as Usual in America. I'm Pia Ontiveros. The Philippines and the U.S. are long-standing allies. We go way back. We're joined today by Philippine Ambassador to the United States, Jose Manuel Babe Romualdez, who is in Washington, D.C., of course. Ambassador Romualdez, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Well, let's begin with this. How would we define Philippine-U.S. relations at this point, given the way President Duterte has related with the U.S. government?
Well, I think right now, our relationship with the United States is that it's a very good relationship. We're in a good place right now. We have our continuing relationship as far as both on the military and the political side of the equation. President Trump has always been very supportive, of course, of the Philippines in terms of our dispute now in the South China Sea. And as we recently, the announcement made by the State Department that they now recognize more than ever the objects of the war. So this administration has been there in the forefront more than in the past. So, but what we see in the future is perhaps the same, except perhaps in a little toned down. It'll be a little bit toned down with the Biden administration if and when he becomes president. Although we have already reached out to some of our friends in the Democratic Party, and they said that some foreign policy advisors of Vice President Biden has indicated that they will continue the policy they have right now in the South China Sea.
So we're in a good place, but you're foreseeing a toned-down relationship if it is Joe Biden who wins the election. Traditionally and historically, Ambassador Romualdez, the Philippines has better relations with the U.S. with a Democratic president, or
in my view and in my experience in the past, watching U.S.-Philippine relations, I think we've always had good relations with mostly Republican presidents because they've always been conservative in their ways of thinking. However, we've always worked also with a Democratic administration here in the United States. We've had some good relations also in the past. I would say it's a little bit even, but more on the side of the Republican when it comes to the policy they have in relationship with the Philippines.
Mm-hmm. Conservative, Mr. Ambassador, meaning they don't in domestic politics. Ganun po ba?
I would think that that's probably it's very important now, especially with President Duterte, that sovereignty is a very important issue. That and I agree with that completely. That there has to be mutual respect. They have to respect our laws. We have our own laws and the rule of law, and that the United States also has their own problems as far as like say human rights and or now terrorist activities that are here locally born terrorist activities like what happened in Michigan recently. So I think that those are the issues that we will have to continue to, the message that we'll have to continue to give here in the United States, that sovereignty is a very important part of what we feel is that we need to communicate to them, that we have to have mutual respect as far as that's concerned.
Since we already have you on the show, I just wanted to ask if you already know, does the embassy already know who is going to be the new U.S. ambassador to the Philippines, given that Ambassador Kim Sung has just left?
Actually, there was already a nominee, but that one didn't go through. It was sort of like withdrawn. So we're just waiting for another nominee. From what I'm told, that there were several names that were being considered, but there's nothing definite yet as of now.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Philippine Ambassador to the U.S., Babe Romualdez. Maraming salamat po sa inyo. This has been a CNN Philippines special presentation, Politics as Usual in America. Thank you for watching. I'm Pio Ontiveros.